Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into something fascinating. These claims you hear about narrative parallels, between Jesus Christ's story and figures from, well, older ancient religions. Our mission here isn't just to list off similarities. We want to unpack them, look at the context, the meaning, get you really well informed.
Exactly. And, to really grasp these kinds of connections, we can't just skim the surface. That's the danger. It's about looking at the whole coherent story for each figure, not just cherry-picking convenient details. Otherwise, it's easy to misinterpret the primary sources completely. What's really interesting, I think, is how universal human experiences, things we call archetypes, they often lead to similar narrative patterns across cultures. But the specifics, the theological weight, the purpose, those can be profoundly different. And that's really what we're exploring today.
Right. So let's establish our baseline first. A quick reminder of the core narrative of Jesus Christ, just so we're all on the same page for comparison. We're talking about the virgin birth, his public ministry, the teachings, miracles, gathering disciples, the transfiguration, then obviously the passion, his crucifixion, burial, and then the absolute pivot, the bodily resurrection and ascension. Now, from a Christian viewpoint, this isn't just a collection of events. It's seen as one unified story of salvation, his perfect life, the atonement for sins, his ongoing role. Okay, so with that framework, let's get into these claims. Now, you've probably heard it suggested, maybe by skeptical scholars, that the Gospels essentially borrowed their marvelous claims, right? It took them straight from older myths. But maybe we should ask, are these pagan parallels really as parallel as some proponents claim?
Well, a common starting point is this idea of dying and rising deities. And it's true, you see figures like Osiris, Tammuz, Attis, Adonis, Persephone, Dionysus. They often experience death, or maybe a descent, and then some kind of rebirth. But here's where the crucial distinction lies, I think. Their stories are typically cyclical, often tied to, say, agricultural seasons, or they return, but it's to the underworld, or maybe a different realm entirely. And crucially, they're often brought back through magic or the actions of others.
Okay, so it's not quite the same singular permanent event.
Precisely. Contrast that with the claim about Jesus, a singular historical bodily resurrection achieved by his own power, leading directly to his ascension and ongoing rule. You mentioned Osiris. Well, he becomes ruler of the dead. He doesn't return to rule the living world. And Dionysus, his so-called rebirth, it's actually from Zeus's thigh after his mother died. It's not a resurrection from death in the same sense at all. The how and the why are fundamentally different.
That's a really key difference in that dying and rising theme. Okay, but what about other areas? Let's talk about miraculous births, because that motif, it seems to pop up everywhere. Romulus, Quetzalcoatl, Buddha, Krishna, Hercules, Mithras, they all have these extraordinary origin stories. So what's the actual nature of these births when you look closely? How do they really stack up?
Right, and if we connect this to the larger theological claims, Jesus' virginal conception, the idea of it being by the Holy Spirit without sexual intercourse, it really stands apart. You compare that to common divine impregnation myths. Often it's quite literal. God's having sexual relations with mortals like Zeus and Acmene producing Hercules. Or sometimes it's symbolic means,
Yeah.
Quetzalcoatl conceived via feathers or an emerald. Mithras is said to have emerged fully formed from a rock. Krishna is described as a physiological son born to human parents. So, you see, the claim for Jesus involves a unique kind of divine conception, setting it apart theologically.
Okay, that clarifies the birth narratives. Now let's hit a couple of other specific claims you often hear bandied about, maybe about Mithras or Horus. These seem to be where the details really matter, like the claim that Mithras had 12 followers.
Yeah, that one comes up. But the source material, when you actually look at it, suggests that's likely a misinterpretation of artwork. It probably depicts 12 astrological signs, or maybe 12 symbolic faces, not 12 human disciples in the way the Gospels describe.
And what about the Mithraic meals, the idea of body and blood terminology being used before Christianity?
Yes. That's a critical one. The earliest solid evidence we have for that kind of terminology in Mithraic rituals actually dates after the Gospels were already written and circulating. So if there was influence, the chronology strongly suggests it went from Christianity to Mithraism, not the other way around.
Okay, that timing is significant. And another one, Horus being crucified.
That's a classic example of anachronism, basically putting something in the wrong time period. Crucifixion was a specifically Roman method of execution. It came much, much later than the ancient Egyptian myths about Horus. There's just no historical basis for that claim.
Right. So pulling this all together, what's the bottom line here?
Well, the bottom line seems to be that while you definitely find superficial resemblances, echoes, maybe the actual specifics, the theological weight, the meaning, and the ultimate purpose of these narratives, they often differ quite profoundly. It brings us back to those archetypes we mentioned earlier. Universal human experiences: birth, death, struggle, the search for meaning, the desire to overcome mortality. It seems plausible that these shared human concerns could independently lead different cultures to develop somewhat similar narrative patterns. It's about exploring a shared human spiritual landscape, perhaps. But the way those patterns are expressed, the unique theological claims attached, that's where the divergence lies. It doesn't necessarily imply direct borrowing or undermine the uniqueness of any single tradition.
So wrapping up, we've seen that while these big themes, extraordinary origins, overcoming death, they do resonate across many ancient cultures. But when you really dig deep, the distinctions are profound. How the stories unfold, what they signify, it's often very different. The specific Christian narrative Jesus' life claimed as sinless, the idea of a once-for-all atonement, that specific bodily resurrection and ascension, it forms a very distinct theological package.
Exactly. And maybe a final thought for you to ponder. These explorations in comparative religion really highlight how, as humans, we seem to share these deep, fundamental questions about existence, about the divine. The answers, the stories that cultures develop, are incredibly diverse and specific. But what does the very prevalence of similar archetypal patterns across these diverse stories tell us about that shared universal human spiritual quest? Something to think about.